or comments. So I'll be moderating that throughout. So feel free to put comments or questions in there. So thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar is about trauma and violence-informed relationships with children and youth in care. I do know that we have some professionals attending today, but the focus of today's webinar is for families and caregivers. Like I said, feel free to use that chat feature, but stay muted unless you're speaking, just so we can make sure that everything's clear today. So like I said, my name is Mackenzie, and we also have another staff member here from the Adoption Support Center. Her name is Kelsey. So she'll be on here as well. Kelsey, do you want to give a little wave or say hi so people can see what you look like?
Hi, everybody. I'm the one that was emailing you all, so sorry about that time change in the email, but glad to see you guys all got here on time.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelsey. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Erin Beckwell. So Erin is a social worker and consultant who spent her career working in the areas of health, education, and community development. Erin's most recent work focuses on mobilizing knowledge and to promote equitable harm reduction based and trauma and violence informed approaches to care and support. She's originally from Treaty 4 territory in southwestern Saskatchewan, and her wife are called Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, home for over 20 years. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Mackenzie. So thanks everyone for taking time out of your evening to join us tonight. So I just need tech support to, are we gonna share the screen or you just put the slides up and advance those? My screen sharing isn't working now.
Oh no, okay. Just 1 second here.
We've had quite a night with the tech issues so far, and it's only 7 minutes after 7, but we'll get there.
Should be good to go now.
Good to go. Sweet. Okay, so as Mackenzie said, tonight we're going to talk a bit about trauma and violence informed care in the work we do in our lives with kids. So in addition to being a social worker, I also have been an adoptive parent myself and currently have our 17-year-old living in my office, which is why, yeah, you might see bits of her life behind me. But yeah, I first want to provide a land acknowledgement. And I think especially when we're talking about trauma and adoption and fostering, it's so critical that we're aware of the impact of that displacement from roots, from the land literally, but also from home, community, culture, and how we've come to this place. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go tonight. But I think it's just so critical that we all begin from a place of acknowledging that, but also reflecting on how in our own lives we can, challenge the history and not repeat it, but sort of change the script a bit. And what this means to us, what our role is to play in this process of reconciliation, and hopefully at some point also making sure that Indigenous kids aren't coming into care as frequently as they currently are. So I wanted to start from a place that might be familiar to many of you, which is the triangle that we often talk about around relationships and foster and adoption journey. And that, we have the child, the adoptive and foster parents, and of course the birth parents. And I'd like you to keep this in mind as I go through the first part of the presentation tonight, and just be thinking about the experiences of all of those parts, all of those people involved in this complex web of relationships, and how experiences with trauma and adversity might be part of what we're seeing in the middle of that triangle. So I like to start my sessions with sort of how do I understand trauma? How do I define it? And so really when we're talking about individual trauma, and there's other kinds of trauma as well, I'm going to spend most of my time tonight talking about trauma experienced by individuals and families. But trauma isn't necessarily about what happens. It is, and we as a society, I think, have been taught, certainly I was taught, that trauma is, abuse and neglect, which of course can be traumatizing. But what we've come to understand about trauma is it's such a broader experience than that. And that what happens is actually almost secondary to what comes after that. And so when we think about trauma, it could be an event, an experience that we can point to a particular time and place and say, that's when that happened. So an example would be when I was 8 years old, my mom and my sisters and I were coming home from Swift Current after a day at Saturday spent shopping in the big city for us, going back to our farm. And we were broadsided by an impaired driver who ran a stop sign coming up to the highway. And that was an event-based trauma, right? At the time, we didn't think about that as a potential trauma. It was like, man, that sucks. Is your truck okay? Like, anybody get seriously hurt? You're good? Okay, then we can move on. And there was still a pretty strong narrative about, well, you can move on from that because it's over now. It can also be a series of events, and certainly event-based trauma, whether it's a single event or multiple events, it's not easier to go through, but it tends to be easier for folks to understand, because we can see that cause and effect. Oh, that was the day that accident happened. So around that time of year, you might start to feel memories of that, or a bit less at ease being in a vehicle or driving down a highway. It could be that maybe driving is difficult after that, and people can kind of understand. So series of events can be related events or unrelated events, but this is when people have had more than one specific event happen in their life that can result in a trauma. Then we have circumstance trauma, and circumstances are harder for folks to understand because they're not a discrete event that we can point to and say, well, then that happened to me on that day, and then I felt this way, or then this started to happen. With circumstance, it's often that's just the way my life is. So with circumstance trauma, examples would be growing up in a home where there's violence, experiencing ongoing emotional or physical neglect, right? That's circumstance. And it's often not about, well, that day bad things happened. The other thing we know is that in circumstance trauma, it can be combined with events, right? So perhaps there's violence in a home, but there's a particular day when things get really intense. Maybe there's an intervention or police, involved, someone gets really hurt, the day that kids are removed from homes. That often then becomes the event on top of the circumstances. And so many of the folks that we encounter when we're fostering or adopting, or when we are adopted, or when we place a child for adoption, even those who work around us in the professional sense, there are often layers and multiple forms of trauma. And I would say most kids who come through the child welfare system aren't just dealing with one of these, often it's all three. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And so when we think about, well, what was your trauma? Everything. It could be so many things that they can't even be named or identified because they may be difficult to separate out, difficult to describe or talk about. And even when you do things like look at a child's file, you might not even really get a sense of this in there. You might have some pieces, of course, but there might not be the ability to see the whole picture. The important thing to understand is this in and of itself is not what trauma is. And often that's what we think it is what happened to you. But that's actually not what the trauma is. Our brains and bodies have to interpret what's happening around us as physically harmful, emotionally harmful, or life-threatening, or all three. And brains work differently from person to person. So what I interpret as potentially or actually emotionally harmful to me might be very different than what the person sitting next to me would interpret as emotionally harmful. And so we react differently to these situations. We assess them differently, depending on our past experience, our developmental age, our cultural background, our gender, and the nature of what's happening, right? And so when our brains start to send off the alarm bells and say, this is not good, this isn't good, then we get into the domain of trauma. And just having that alert go off that says, well, this is not okay, bad things are happening or about to happen or could happen, doesn't necessarily mean trauma is going to be caused, but it's one of the conditions. So you have to experience that event, series of events or circumstances, and your brain has to be interpreting that as actually or potentially harmful. So the other important thing to remember about how our brains interpret is I can be in a family home with siblings, and what my brain interprets as potentially or actually harmful or life-threatening could be very different than what my sibling interprets. And we often see in families, whether these are kids who come into care or are adopted, or we see them in our own families, where my interpretation, my experience of what happened in my family of origin can be quite different than my siblings. Because we have different brains, we've had different life experience, we interpret the world in different ways, even though we grew up in the exact same house. We didn't. We grew up in totally different homes because we interpret those and experience them as different. And so that's a critical piece to remember, because often, especially I find in siblings or within family units, there's this sense of, well, I grew up with that too, and I'm fine. It didn't traumatize me. And the reality is it might have, and it's just being coped with in a different way that doesn't look as problematic or otherwise, sort of dysfunctional or disordered as how another person copes. And that's very common, where one person's coping strategies become identified as the problem. And then it can erase the experience of other people in that home. If they're coping in ways that are seen as appropriate, social, and so on, they may actually be masking some of the trauma. And so the third piece of it is that trauma has to have a long-term impact, usually negative or adverse, on our functioning. So our ability to just get out of bed, take care of ourselves, take care of our children, go to work, go to school, do the things we need to do. It might impact our mental or cognitive functioning, our memories. Very common that there are memory disruptions, and that can vary and change. It's kind of fluid and weird. It can impact our ability to think, to comprehend what's happening around us, to problem solve. It can impact us on a physical level, which is really where things get interesting. And we can see folks who've had a trauma history. We have research now that's telling us that, yeah, this is legit. People end up with chronic pain. They might end up with gut issues, migraines. Often this stuff starts to show itself in our physical health. And we may go to a doctor, we may go to the hospital, we may get a million tests. And often the outcome, if it's trauma-based, is you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you. And that can be immensely challenging for people experiencing it, because this is very real distress and pain. It's not made up. It's not necessarily, even a disorder. It is a legitimate way that our bodies and brains try to process unthinkable experiences. And so we can see people who have a complex mix of physical health symptoms. And of course, trauma is just one part of people's stories. And so when we think about how other experiences, other conditions intersect with this, things like FASD or learning disabilities, mental health issues, a lot of this can get pretty messy to try to determine what are we actually looking at. And so a trauma and violence informed approach says, let's just assume one of the ingredients in the mix is trauma, and let's respond accordingly. It's not going to harm anyone. It's not going to, because trauma isn't about diagnosing people with, disorder or problem. It doesn't further sort of take people down that road, and it can be incredibly beneficial. We also see impacts, of course, in relationships. So in people's social well-being, they may struggle with boundaries that become very rigid. They may have very fluid boundaries, or it might even feel like they have no boundaries. We also see folks who may struggle with relationships with people of particular gender. There may be triggers around relationship, people coming into spaces, touching but even being able to trust others, of course, experiencing these things has a profound impact on most people's ability to trust others. And that may be very selective and specific. It can also be generalized. Then this impacts often our emotional regulation, our ability to sort of manage emotions as they come. So people may end up experiencing really big swings in emotion. And of course, that can often overlap or intersect with experiences around other mental health conditions. And it can impact us on a spiritual level. And that doesn't necessarily mean that only if we are very religious or spiritual, like we know we're spiritual, we talk about it, that it affects us this way. It can actually kind of sneak up on you. And so there have been a few studies that have pointed to folks who are impacted on a spiritual level. So that would be, how could the world, as I understand it, the world as I believe it to be, allow this to happen? And that may be, how could God allow this to happen? How could Creator? How could the universe? However people understand it, it's not really about the belief. It's about, does this experience disrupt people's sense of connection spiritually? And if it does, there's actually been a few studies that have started to say maybe we need to be careful with folks who experience this spiritual impact, because there may be a heightened risk of suicide in these folks, where if beliefs have brought them comfort, having those beliefs challenged in such an extreme way can be very, very detrimental to a person's overall well-being. And of course, for lots of folks, we see the impact bounce around all of these. It might touch every single one of these. It may be concentrated in certain areas at one period of life and then start to pop up in other areas. So basically, the definition I use is that trauma is an experience that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope, which is also why we see those differences in sibling groups or in family units, even in people who've all experienced the same traumatic or potentially traumatic event. So my sisters and my mom and I all experienced the exact same collision on that night when I was 8 years old. But my youngest sister was in preschool. She has very little conscious memory of that day. She doesn't remember going to the hospital. She doesn't remember the ambulance ride. I, though, felt like I had to be in charge of my sisters and take care of my mom. So my experience of that was very, very different. But also, what's your coping style? How broad and how deep are your coping strategies? Are they easily overwhelmed? Do you have one thing that you go to? Is it going to be taken down by the big wave of trauma when it comes to hit you? And everybody copes differently, so everybody's capacity to cope is different. And we all know that I cope better when I'm well rested and when I'm feeling well physically and when I feel supported and accepted. And there's so many things that allow me to weather the storm. And when those things are in jeopardy, so when I think about kids who are placed in a new home, right? We basically destabilized, hopefully temporarily, their coping, and they may go hard into the things that have helped them feel safe or in control in the past. And it's possible that those placements or even meeting a potentially adoptive family for the first time, these can actually be experiences that could become additional traumas for folks. These could be re-traumatizing. We don't intend them to be, but that doesn't mean they're not. It may be that that person, depending on where they're at, what's going on, how things have happened, what else they've experienced, may find these moments just so overwhelming that their brain cannot process what is happening. So trauma isn't what happened to you, it's what happens inside you. And so what we've got inside, how our brain works, right? How we process the world developmentally, what can we understand? So a child who's very young, it's not that they don't remember what happens. And I think a lot of us have been taught that, oh, when you're really young, you don't remember. There are also increasing mounds of evidence that are telling us that's not entirely true. People might not have concrete memory or accessible memory of events, but it may come up at different points in their life and they may not be able to make sense of it or understand it or even articulate it, but that doesn't mean they don't remember in some way. There's also the lovely science of epigenetics, which looks at how our experiences like trauma in essence, transmitted from person to person across generations. We also know that when people are pregnant, their stress level, the sort of environment influences that developing child. And that can also create conditions where children are born into the world already reacting to their environment as if they'd experienced trauma. And they haven't, but it's coming through the hormone saturation in that pregnant person's body while that child is developing there. So there's so many layers to this. You can imagine that it must be messy and complicated, and that really is the nature of trauma. There aren't any clear-cut and easy answers here, which can be really tough. But one of the things that has brought me great comfort as someone who has a trauma story, who lives with people with trauma stories as well, and works surrounded by folks with trauma histories, is that recovery is possible, but we can also learn to interact with each other in different ways that accommodate the trauma response, or at least try to understand it. So the other thing I want to acknowledge before we move on from sort of the definitions part is that the historical trauma is real. And it is often described as intergenerational trauma. And so we hear about this typically in the context of Indigenous folks in this part of the world, but this can happen in other groups as well, where we see often widespread impact of trauma. And I sometimes refer to this as very high trauma saturation. So where trauma isn't unusual, it's the norm. And everyone, even if not experiencing it directly, is surrounded by people who are impacted by it. Therefore, they become impacted by it. And if it's not addressed or resolved or given opportunities for healing, then the next generation is born into that as well. This is not just if you didn't grow up with your parents in your parents' home, like kids who went to residential school or who would have been part of the 60s scoop, they didn't see how parenting was done, so they didn't know how to parent. That's often how we teach this. And in reality, it's far more complicated than people didn't see how to be a parent or learn how to parent properly. Often the reality is it is happening on a cellular level. That epigenetic impact is priming people for trauma before they've even had a chance to sort of experience the world. People's coping capacity may be compromised or very thin. So people may not have a lot of depth. They also may not have a lot of breadth to their coping. So they may have one or two go-to strategies that may actually result in additional challenges or additional trauma even. And often alongside historical trauma is this massive sense of unresolved collective grief. And that is something that also comes up a lot when we're talking about working with kids in the foster care system or adopting kids, is looking at the grief and loss. That for those of us who are adoptive parents, this may be one of the experiences that helps us overcome the losses we maybe have had. Some of us have had a lot of losses leading to an adoption. But for the child who's being adopted, the children who are being adopted, this can very much be another loss. And it can trigger this collective trauma, this historical experience of trauma. The other thing I will add is there are some people already theorizing that the pandemic is an experience of collective trauma. And those of us who have trauma histories predating the last year, we have been in a state of some degree of trauma response where we've had to dip into that coping strategy over and over. And of course, there's been lots of talk about the mental health impact of trauma or of the pandemic. And we need to just remember that if we're adding on another layer of trauma for folks that's not acknowledged, that's not talked about, and that we're not understanding how people are coping might be a trauma response, we could be actually compounding or intensifying that experience of trauma. So given that definition, you can imagine then how almost anything can be traumatizing. And some people go, hey, wait a second, are you saying that like the whole world is traumatized? Trauma is far more common than most people have any idea of. And a lot of what we have sort of rationalized and viewed as just inevitable, ordinary, may actually be a trauma response. We often maybe don't name it as such unless we go to counseling or work with an elder or a spiritual counselor of some sort who can help us name and understand, why do I react this way when this happens? And some of the things that happen out of trauma are actually very interesting, innovative, and sometimes quite functional adaptations that may be some of the things that make us successful. And certainly that's been one of the greatest learnings for me, is that certainly the traumatic things I've experienced have caused all sorts of adversity, all sorts of problems for me, but they've also increased my empathy and compassion. They've increased my critical thinking skills. They have helped me be who I am today. And not that I'm going, yeah, I'm glad I experienced that trauma. No way. I would do anything some days to go back and not have experienced the things I've experienced. Because when it comes up in ways that aren't helping me be, a prof or a presenter or a activist or a social worker, they are sometimes really impairing in terms of my ability to function in the world. And I often feel like, even after 20 plus years of doing healing work on my trauma, there are moments when I don't get to control how I react. And that's still something that I'm mourning the loss of that. So you can see then that almost anything, and when you think about the families who care for kids, the families who are having their children apprehended or placing children for adoption and making that choice. And then when you think about caregivers and parents as well, adoptive and foster, you can see collectively there's a lot of this going on, right? And some of this might not be in the past, it may be happening right now, and it may be a part of life moving forward. So when we think about things like healthcare experiences, most people are like, healthcare systems are for getting better and healing, and they're for getting cared for. And if you haven't had an experience of trauma related to the healthcare system, it's really hard to wrap your head around sometimes. But for me, part of my story is I grew up with a lot of health issues, and I often was terrified going to the hospital, having procedures done. I had a lot of pain that when I was really, really tiny, the belief was, well, kids don't really remember pain, so let's not medicate them for pain. So I had procedures done with no pain medication. I often had pain dismissed, and came to associate healthcare providers with pain and with not being heard and not feeling safe. And so that combo means, to this day, I worked in the health authority for about 6 years, and I some days had to really brace myself to walk into the hospital, to go to that meeting, to talk to that physician, because those triggers can be so, so strong. And of course, family disconnection, immigration, forced migration, displacement. So refugees, folks who are adopting internationally, maybe encountering children and families that's part of their story. People who experience bullying, humiliation, social exclusion, discrimination, especially in that structural, ongoing way where it's part of their daily life and often not acknowledged by people who are not part of their group. It may actually be denied by others. And for some, the experiences of school are traumatizing. And of course, being arrested, involved with police, incarcerated, and so on. And so we can see so much. So what happens is, when people experience this and our brains just don't know how to cope and we get overwhelmed, we start swapping out patterns of protection, which is how humans are wired, is to connect with others. People need other people. We don't survive well in isolation, and we are learning that actively right now. What happens though, our brain says, actually, connection isn't safe. So we're going to prioritize protection. And so safety becomes the filter through which all of the world is experienced. And so connection becomes really challenging. And for those of us who are caregivers, foster parents, adoptive parents, people working with kids and families, no matter what role you're in. Really, we often want to connect. That's our yearning. That's what we hope for. That's what we've sometimes been trained to do, right? Is we get that connection going with people who have a trauma history. If they are triggered, they're in a place where they cannot connect with us. Their brain tells them connection is unsafe. So go into this from a safety mindset, a protective mindset. And what that can look like is a whole bunch of stuff. So most of us are familiar with fight or flight, right, as a response. And these are essentially our brain going on autopilot. Our brain takes control and we don't get to weigh out cause and effect. So what are the consequences of our actions? What's the best course of action right now? Who might get hurt if I do this? What's going to serve me well? What's going to help me connect? Those are not how we're thinking, because that's like, you know, frontal lobe stuff. That's executive functioning, impulse control, right? And of course, we also know if folks are experiencing things like FASD or other brain-based differences, that also can impact how information and environments are interpreted and responded to. Add in some trauma, oh, it's going to be a mixed bag and probably sometimes pretty messy and bumpy. And so the brain goes on autopilot. So we kind of go back to that survival mode, this very primitive, primal response to the world, which is we need to stay alive. That is the number one priority right now. And of course, for all of us at any moment, that is our priority. But when you're in that pattern of protection, it is not something you can easily shift out of, especially if you're unaware that that's what's happening and you haven't been given an opportunity to develop coping strategies or other responses when you can sense that's where you're going. So we see people go into this fight or flight. So people who go into fight doesn't necessarily mean they're literally going to fight. They often have a sense of safety when they feel like they have power and they're in control. And so these folks may have a strong sense of justice. So they may be somebody who's known for standing up and saying things. And in kids, it's fascinating. We may label these as really negative behaviors, but we can reframe as like, yeah, you have a really strong sense of right and wrong or justice. So kids who are known as tattletales, right? You told on someone, they have a strong sense of justice. That wasn't okay, I'm telling somebody, right? But sometimes there's negative social consequences to that. And we also, though, see folks who go into a fight response as defensive, sometimes suspicious, may see anger and rage, agitation, very impulsive decision-making. And sometimes we see this sort of going big phenomenon. So taking up big space physically, maybe emotionally, maybe in terms of the volume. And it's interesting because I never saw myself as someone who bumps into this fight response. And part of it was because I was taught originally about trauma that people sort of go into one or the other, fight or flight. The reality is we all move through all of these. We may have some that we tend to maybe get stuck in or spend more time in or go to more naturally when we're in that trauma response. But I'm one who I take up space physically, but also I tend to have my wife told me the other day, are you even capable of whispering? I don't think you have that skill. Like, did you miss that? Because I tend to have like big voice, right? And I don't shrink in very often. But the reality is I grew up feeling like I was, partly because part of my trauma is not being heard, not feeling seen. And so I've learned over the years that I've adapted that it's safer to go in taking up big space and make sure I'm seen and heard. Flight is keeping distance will keep me safe. So those could be people who don't show up to visits, don't show up when they're supposed to come home, don't make it to school, maybe call in sick to work a lot, maybe just feel absent in other ways, maybe physically there, but emotionally or cognitively just not with us, right? We see folks who use a variety of strategies to numb or avoid the feelings of the world, the relationships in the world, the frightening parts of the world, right? The unsafe parts. So that can be substance use, Sometimes people use food this way. They may be using gaming this way, scrolling through phones or, social media feeds, that sort of thing. That mindlessness is often part of a flight response for folks with a trauma history. For some people, it also becomes, if I'm perfect, I'll be safe. Which is an interesting twist on the flight response. It's this, I'm going to create protection through perfection. And so here we see things that are often not viewed as really problems. So for me, I'm a notorious workaholic, and I struggle with boundaries around my own time, my own energy, and so on. I also lean towards overthinking, which, like I said, trauma has made me a really much better critical thinker than I think I might have been otherwise. That's partly the strengths-based flip on my overthinking, right? Is I'm very committed to thinking critically about the world, but that can also lead us into perfectionism. And so some of you may be listening to this thinking, oh my gosh, she's talking about me. It may be that this is part of a trauma response for you. It may be that you've developed these type of adaptations in response to other things you've had happen in your life, conditions in your family, your community, different things you've experienced. And whether you define those or think of them as trauma or not, it's important to understand that when it is trauma, these are things that people do unconsciously, right? They are not making a choice. It is often this sense that I am on autopilot. I don't have full control over what's happening, and I'm just doing stuff. And so you may hear people say, like, I don't know why I do that. I don't know why I react like that. And we can challenge that. Oh, yes, you do know why, or yes, you do know when that's going to happen. And if it's trauma related, it may very well be that they don't see it coming. I've heard people describe it as, I felt blindsided by it. The reason I use a lot of water imagery when I talk about trauma is I had when I was a trauma therapist, I had a client who said, have you ever been to the ocean? And I said, yeah, actually I have. And she said, have you ever been standing there just enjoying, your feet are in the ocean, you're standing in the water, it's just lapping against your legs. And then all of a sudden one of those waves comes out of the blue, it seems sometimes, and just knocks your feet out from under you. And you panic and you flail around and you think you're dying. And then all of a sudden somebody says, put your feet down. And in your brain, you're already getting swept out to sea, never coming back. And that's the end for you. That's kind of what trauma can be like for folks. That sense that I didn't expect that, or I thought I knew how this was going to go. And then bam, my feet are out from under me. And in my brain, I'm not interpreting things in a logical or rational way. I'm panicked because I'm being swept out to sea and I can't stop it from happening. And somebody looks at me and goes, you're in a foot of water, put your feet down, you're fine. It's that disconnect between what's happening in the here and now, and people get pulled into this world where they're responding as if they're in another place and time. They may not have conscious awareness of what that place and time is, how it relates to what happened right now, but it's almost beyond their control. So then more recently, we've sort of expanded our understanding of trauma response to include a freeze response. It's safest if I stop and stay. If I just, some people curl up in a ball and just hunker down, right? Maybe people can't speak, so they literally shut down. Sometimes we see this as symptoms that look like depression. People who are very isolated, don't have a wide social network. We may see fatigue, hibernating, sleeping all day. And of course, we know developmentally, like teenagers, that's actually typical. That's not necessarily a trauma response, right? But this is where we can't shift out of it. And it feels safest to just hibernate away. Some people can function, move around in the world, but maybe with a sense of disconnection at times, or dissociation, where I'm here, but I'm not here. They may notice gaps in remembering their day or a particular conversation. That may be an indicator that they're disconnecting or dissociating. Sometimes folks get stuck in this place of despondency. There's nothing that will make my life better. There's no point in trying. It doesn't matter what you do, what support I have, how strong you think I am, nothing will get better. And for some folks, that's actually one of the most challenging positions to try to support someone from, especially if it's in a trauma response. Often there's a sense that I don't know if I can pull this person out of this place of despondency. We also see folks who, instead of having really big emotion they're stuck in, like despondency, go to that place of flat affect. So they have very little emotional range. And some of you may have encountered children or others who just don't have a lot emotionally. That may be part of a trauma response. So if people are like that all the time, it's usually not. It's when people switch and you see, okay, you were engaging with me and you were smiling, or your eyes, lit up, or something gave me an indicator that you were experiencing emotion. And then all of a sudden went, nothing. And when you see it, you can recognize it. It's like, oh, what happened? What's going on? All of a sudden there's nothing there. We also see folks get stuck, frozen in this place of indecisiveness, inaction, maybe slow to respond. And of course, this also overlaps with lots of other pieces that may be happening for folks like FASD. There's so much overlap between FASD and trauma response, partly because of the involvement of executive functioning often. That frontal lobe stuff tends to kind of mash all up together. The fawn response is the one people tend to know the least about. These are folks who feel safest if in relationship with others, they just sort of let go of all their own needs and wants and boundaries. It's all about other people, making other people happy, avoiding conflict, going along with the crowd. And of course, we know developmentally, teenagers, this tends to be what they naturally do. So we have to consider age and developmental stages or phases as well. But if people develop a pattern of this and it seems to be persistent even when it doesn't serve them well, or they are unable to shift out of it, or they pop into it at particular moments, that's some indication that might be trauma related. They may be very deferential. So just, I don't know, whatever you want. They may be great caregivers and very concerned about others, but it may be to their own detriment. So one person I worked with, for example, was living on a very fixed income young woman who was on disability income, so SED program. And she had grown up in foster care, experienced unthinkable types of trauma. And one of the things she would do is, even though she didn't earn enough income to pay her own rent and groceries and care for herself, she often lent money to people or gave money to people or would go and buy groceries for other people and then have nothing herself. And when we started talking about it, it made perfect sense given her experience of growing up in a home where there was pretty profound physical neglect, where they didn't often have food. They were moving around a lot because they got evicted a lot. And she just wanted someone to step in and say, here, I bought you some groceries. And she remembers sitting as a kid, just hoping someone would come and take care of them. And it never came. And then her and her siblings were ultimately taken into the care of the ministry. And she said it got worse from there. It didn't make it better. And so that person that she thought might come and take care of them actually was the sort of the conduit to additional trauma. So she, as an adult, when she was traumatized or feeling unsafe, she automatically went to this place of, I'm going to be the person I never got when I was a kid. And it took a lot of sort of processing to figure that out and find a balance where you can be a very caring person, you can be very tuned to others' needs, but that doesn't mean you have to suffer for it. And in her brain, though, that was exactly the trade-off, was I'm either the person who rescues or the person who suffers. And she wanted to be the person who cared. They're often very considerate of others' needs, which is a lovely thing, but with no consideration for their own needs, right? So I had a client who used to go out and eat food that made her sick because that was where her friends liked to eat, and she couldn't tell them that she got violently ill every time she ate a particular kind of food. That's an example of, sort of being almost over considerate. So these folks may tend to go small, try not to take up space or be an inconvenience or a bother. And it can be very common often in kids who have learned that that's how they can be safe if in a foster home or in a new home, is try not to be a problem, just fly under the radar, and that can become a fawn response. So I've mentioned this a couple times, but how trauma shows up for us can be impacted by how old we were or where we were developmentally when we experienced trauma or began first experiencing trauma, how we understand and make sense of what happened, whether we can do that, what coping strategies we have access to, right? How this then unfolds across our lifespan, our culture, gender, our current age and developmental stage, our general temperament, so our sort of response to stress, our coping capacity, breadth and depth, our attachment experiences. So have we been able to develop a safe, trusting relationship with a caregiver, especially early in life? And how can that be a foundation we can use to come back to if we are feeling highly stressed or triggered? How long the trauma endured, how intense, complexity, our access to compassionate, affirming witnesses. So people who hear what we experienced or see what we experienced and say, wow, that's intense, that's brutal, that's awful what happened to you. Not try to fix it, not try to explain why it happened, not try to get people to counseling right away, but somebody who can bear witness to our pain and say, wow, that's pretty incredible you survived that. I don't know if I could survive that. Or it makes sense to me that you're struggling with this now based on what I know about what's happened in your life, right? That's an affirming, compassionate witness. And that is a critical ingredient in people being able to actually, number one, if you get it when your sort of experience or event happens in the first place, it can actually prevent trauma from developing. So it's incredibly important, but no matter when it happens, it can be a critical step in healing. And then connection to safe, accessible, and appropriate supports, whether those are physical health supports, emotional support, social support, cultural, spiritual, that people need that. And go to mental health isn't always the answer. And for some people, actually, that can be a place that is triggering or is not appropriate or effective for them. So a few of these, and I know you have a copy of the slides, I hope. I think you're going to get one anyway. You're welcome to use these slides individually as images if you'd like, print them off. This is one I used to have printed at my workstation. And it was a good reminder that once triggered in the brain, trauma trumps logic every single time. And that's exactly how it's supposed to work. Our brains are supposed to alert us and sort of take the reins, they're running the show when we are in a life-threatening situation. What happens with trauma is we start to develop of safety or unsafety. So our brain starts to get triggered too quickly, and it starts to misinterpret situations as unsafe when indeed they might be. And it starts to tell us we are in a life-threatening or very actually aren't. And so this can be, you're safe here, everything's fine, no one's coming to get you. And yet we're going into a trauma response as if our life is threatened. So this is just a little glitch that develops because people experience these really intense and difficult. It's also critical to know that often services, intentionally or unintentionally, mirror parts of people's trauma story. So this doesn't mean that people go to work every day, that we take kids into our home with an intent to traumatize them at all. But what it means is unintentionally, the way that children especially, but birth parents and adoptive and foster parents move through these systems together, often we are recreating this and we don't know we're doing it. So examples are sometimes, where we do visits, if they're supervised, might be in a room that is really triggering for that parent or that child or both, because it might be very similar to an interview room they had to go in when something happened that was really awful, or an examining room, and it's not that is literally a threatening space, but their brain is saying, wait a second, this isn't okay. It can also be that we expect people to give up control. So when we look at kids coming into care or being adopted, the kids themselves, depending on their age, may not have choice, may not have much ability to influence those decisions, so they don't feel they're in control. And if part of their trauma story is feeling like things are happening that they can't control, that often is where things get a little rocky. So I'm just going to pause for a minute and see if there's any questions or comments in the chat that I can address before I carry on.
There hasn't been anything so far yet, Erin.
Okay, all right. Well, if folks have comments or questions or examples, situations that you're like, okay, wait a second, Erin, what about this? Please feel free to throw those in the chat, and Mackenzie can bring them to my attention. So going back to the beginning of the session, and I was sort of showed the triangle, right? Well, when we think about all the trauma stories, right, that often we're thinking, well, that child has experienced trauma. And I think most of us are aware of that to some extent. We might not understand the breadth and depth of the trauma. They might not even understand it. But we often acknowledge that's there. We also are getting better at acknowledging that birth parents have experienced trauma. And that often is part of the experience of their kids coming into care or making a decision to place kids for adoption and so on. But then we also know adoptive and foster parents are human too. Caregivers are human. Lots of us have trauma stories. We may or may not have acknowledged that or received support around that or talked about it much. But all of that mashes up in the middle of that triangle. It's part of that relationship. And it is sometimes the piece that we are not all aware is maybe being triggered when we're trying to work with birth parents, or when we're trying to support a child, or when we're trying to negotiate what does it mean to be foster parents or adoptive parents with a partner, where maybe this is stressful stuff. Like, I will never forget the early days of our experience with adoption, and it nearly meant the end of our marriage. It was really intense, really difficult. I didn't have an understanding of trauma the way I do now. My interest in trauma was actually really spurred by our experience with adoption. But I think, and neither of us were necessarily feeling traumatized by the system at the time. It was our histories were coming up and we didn't know what that was about. Why was I reacting so big when our daughter did certain things or when certain things were happening? I had no experience with the system prior to her coming into our life or for us applying to adopt. And so I didn't expect it. And nobody talked about it. And it was a very, very interesting thing. But then when we think about the bigger picture, right? Service providers, yeah, we got trauma stories too. So do people in our support networks. It might be our neighbor, our parents, our siblings, our, circle of friends, all of that. Maybe the people we see at church or the teacher our kid interacts with at school is all part of it. So there's so much coming into this web of relationship that often is unacknowledged. And it doesn't mean we can tidy that up in a really easy way. The important thing is really to acknowledge it's there and treat ourselves with compassion, try to view others with compassion, and try to think trauma and violence informed, which means, as I said earlier, assume that everybody's got trauma stuff going on. So if I'm working, right now I work as an instructor at the university. If I'm working with a student and their reaction is illogical in some way, or they're displaying big emotion, or they're shutting down, or they're just going along with what's going on, and I'm thinking, this is a little bit interesting, or they change, they shift in some way that I can notice. Of course, all of this is harder now that I'm teaching across a computer. But when I was in the classroom, I could sense, yeah, you okay? You got something going on. Those of us who are parents, we also see this in our kids, right? We maybe can sense it in our partner. Maybe we notice something is weird about the kid's worker this time that they're over. So go to trauma first. We don't need to ask. We don't need the person to tell us what happened. Like I've said, sometimes we can't. We don't remember. We don't have words. We don't trust enough. It doesn't feel safe. So this eliminates the need to go digging around in people's trauma. And if that comes up at some point that they want to do it, great. But it may be harmful and inappropriate to actually just start asking, so tell me about the trauma you've experienced. So if that's not our job, and so when I was a trauma therapist, that was my job. But for most of us, we don't really need to know. We can just shift our approach to say, what if this meltdown my kid's having is a trauma response? How would that change the way I interact with them? And so, why is it that every time we go to, down to the ministry office to sign a form, I start to get angry or defensive? What's that about? Could that be trauma? And really just sort of inserting some of these questions and filters in our thinking. And so trauma and violence informed care is really about shifting away from judgment. And I'm going to talk in a minute about connection seeking or safety seeking rather than attention seeking. That's been one of the biggest shifts for me, is often when we see, especially with kids, behaviors, but people apply this to adults too. They're just attention seeking. What if we changed one word in there and said, what if they're connection seeking or safety seeking? Does that change how we are about that situation, how we react, what we expect, sometimes what we demand? Does it change our response? And often it can just give us a moment of pause to go, okay, is it necessarily negative that this child or this adult is seeking attention? Is it about they're trying to get attention or be seen as a way of feeling safer, as a way of connecting? So maybe they're trying to push through protection to connection, and we're going, no, not okay. Does trauma and violence informed care mean it's like everybody's doing whatever they want and all behaviors allowed? No. It doesn't mean everything is dismissed and we, there's nothing happens when you do this. We don't have boundaries. No, it's about how can I understand a bit about what's going on here in a different way, that I may respond in a different way. That may shift the situation. It may not. Sometimes it's not enough, right? Especially when we have all those layers and mashup of things going on. This might not be enough to change the game, but it may plant a seed where we can work towards connection over time if we respond from that place of compassion, person-centered. So the focus is on safety first. So safety and trust are huge, right? So that means predictability, transparency, and consistency, which most of us know, especially those of us who are in the sort of parenting or caregiver role, that's so critical. But kids especially have experienced trauma, but partners, parents, right, birth parents, everybody responds better when they know what the rules are, when they know, okay, there isn't going to be a change in what's allowed or what's expected of me. And so the other thing is understanding what we often label as behaviors, as safety seeking again, or even just adding the word stress in front. This is a stress behavior. So often we label things as, oh, that's a behavior. It's a stress behavior. When, especially children, but we see this in adults all the time, experience stress that overwhelms their capacity to cope. What comes? If they've got a trauma history, often a trauma response. And so this is maybe a reflection of some stress that we might not see, we might not feel it. That doesn't mean it's not real. One of the main ways we can engage with people in a trauma and violence informed way is to foster a sense of control through offering choices. Big choices. Which room would you like to be yours? That's a big choice. We often can't offer those big choices, right? We often have only little choices we can offer. Okay, this is going to be your room. If you feel safer with the bed facing a different way, let me know because we can switch that up. That's it, right? And a lot of the time, if we're not thinking trauma, we may not be thinking safety, or we may be thinking physical safety, the stuff that they check when they come through your house from the ministry. But safety is so much bigger than that. And it's a person's sense of whether this space, this time, these people are safe. And it might not have anything to do with whether we are actually safe. It's a sort of echo from the past. Also trying to go strengths-based as much as possible, which can help people feel a greater sense of power. And so rather than thinking of problems or disorders, trauma and violence-informed approaches tend to think of coping strategies. So rather than saying, well, clearly you have clinical depression, which was one of the first diagnoses that I received from on the mental health front. What I later understood after a whole bunch of work on various parts of my trauma experience is that I was actually going into a freeze state all the time. And when it started, I was a teenager, so it got kind of messy to figure out. And people are like, yeah, teenagers, right? But it didn't shift. And I went to university, started my career, and I still was really struggling. And I was labeled as treatment-resistant depression. And so finally I said, well, if the treatment isn't working, I'm going off my meds, which was ill-advised. Started to taper off, felt worse, went back on, still felt bad. Happened to find a counselor who specialized in trauma by accident, who started looking at these things, right? And then we started adjusting my meds, and I haven't been on antidepressants for over 20 years. That's maybe a fairly dramatic story, but it was one of the first experiences where I went, oh, so me not wanting to get out of bed for days might not just be because my brain chemicals are imbalanced. It might mean my brain actually is interpreting the world in a weird way. And I need to find ways to seek safety that I can control, that I can feel that sense of power again. And often people who've had mental health issues, feel quite like their life is out of control, or that they don't have that sense of power to improve things. And so shifting away from, doesn't mean we walk away from diagnosis and disorder. Those are valid frameworks that are needed in a lot of situations. And so this isn't an anti-diagnosis, anti-medication approach, but it certainly asks us to look beyond diagnosis and disorder, which can, in some cases, be another source of trauma for folks. I worked with a young woman who, at the age of 19, it had been diagnosed with 6 different mental illnesses. And she said, so if I work on some stuff and I get better, am I undiagnosed with those things? She already was getting that this was going to follow her for her life, and partly because of her history and her story, and her identity, she had a sense that this wasn't going to be something people were willing to say, oh, you're better. She's like, I'm always going to have this, aren't I? Yeah. And she was getting better, but wasn't supported in any conversations about considering that what she was diagnosed based on might have been driven or amplified by her trauma experience. And she wanted to see what would it be like if I wasn't assuming I was bipolar or had borderline personality disorder, which was another one of the lovely labels she'd experienced. If I learned to cope with my trauma differently, would those things shift? But we know in the health system in particular, but the education system, the justice system, and social services as well, those things often do follow people, and they don't get sort of erased when people start to do healing work, if that's part of their story. This also means we need to acknowledge that we have power as a parent, as a worker, and that we're in a different position, maybe relative to a birth parent or a child, and that can in and of itself be triggering for folks. So we need to attend to that power imbalance and at least acknowledge it. The other piece is acknowledging, especially when we're working with Indigenous children and families, that historical trauma, the ongoing trauma, including the experience of racism, is a source of trauma for many people that doesn't get acknowledged. Understand that how we understand trauma is shaped by culture. In some languages, there is no word for trauma. There's no ability to describe it, or it's believed to be caused by other things. So we need to have some ideas about that, and also understand how our cultural interpretation of trauma influences the way we feel about what's happening and what the world looks like. So here's an example of what often is labeled as a problem: self-harm. Big one, see it pretty regularly. it actually might be about self-regulation. So trying to calm, soothe, settle, trying to have control over one's body when we've had experiences where that's been taken from us, sometimes violently, right? So self-harm, not that we want people to keep on self-harming, that's a great coping strategy, but reframing it as that's not the problem, that's an attempt to cope. What's the problem? Right? And it's what happened, not necessarily what's going on. So that might mean taking an approach where it's like understanding why people would do this. And that applies to things like substance use, right? Substance use is one of the most effective ways of managing trauma response known to humans. Does it have a massive downside? You betcha. But it's one of the most sort of instantaneous and powerful anesthetics from the horrible dysfunction, discomfort that comes with a trauma response, especially for folks who go into those really heightened states like fight and flight. This may be how people are able to actually function. And of course, their functioning is also negatively impacted, but they may feel more themselves, more in their body, more connected, more able to cope, even if that's not always true, or there's a big downside to it. So this is a way people can disconnect from trauma, numb out from what's happening, create some space between their conscious awareness and what their brain is churning out in terms of trauma response. And when people discover this, and often, kids are experiencing this, maybe with some kids, they experiment once, and if they got a trauma history, they may go, oh, I have never felt this okay before. And off we go, right? Is seeking that again and again, which can be sort of the precursor for substance use issues. And in some people it's, oh, that helps, but I don't like other things about how it makes me feel. And for some people, substance use actually can be triggering because they don't feel in control. So for some kids, adults too, they might be like, you know what, I tried that and it helped in some ways, but I felt like I wasn't fully in control or aware of what was happening around me. And that was terrifying, or that made me feel worse. So nope, that one doesn't work. Maybe they, avoid things then. And I saw that when I worked in health a lot, folks who didn't go to doctors, didn't get things looked at because there was an association with those, healthcare environments or healthcare providers. So they would avoid it. People who have trauma associated with dentists, I'm just not going to get my teeth checked. That's a nice way to deal with that. But what if school is the trigger? What if home is the trigger? What if going where you got to go to visit your kids is the trigger? Then what do we do? And so if we're thinking trauma, it allows us to pause and say, okay, could it be that walking up to this school is triggering this kid, and that's why they take off and they don't go to school? It's not that they don't want to, they don't understand why they need to, maybe they don't like learning. Maybe it's none of those things. It may be walking up to those doors, something trips in their brain and they're running before they know what's happening, or they're hiding, or they're going in angry, ready for a fight. And so those things become really, really critical. We also see boundaries as a way that people try to either over control who, when, what information, intimacy, physical contact others can have. So people might become tightly controlled. Nobody's getting to me. I am a closed book. I have a big walls. Or people just say, I have learned I can't control. People touch me whether I want them to or not. People ask me for information. I feel I have to provide it. I don't get a choice. People move me around and it's not my call. And so it may be that those folks sort of abdicate responsibility for boundaries and say, well, if everybody else gets to decide, then I'm not going to, I'm going to let whoever wants to touch me. I'm going to be an open book. And for me, this actually appeared as a result of some of my healthcare experiences, where as a kid, I was photographed for a medical textbook when I was 5 in nothing but my underwear. And it was traumatizing because it wasn't my choice. My parents made that decision. And I don't think we're trying to harm me. But it was a trauma for me, absolutely traumatizing for me. And I remember it vividly, even though my mom who was with me, she's like, I don't even remember that. And I'm like, yeah, I do. I remember every moment of it. And one of the things that's happened to me as a result of that, when I'm in healthcare settings, I'm often like, yeah, don't worry about pulling the curtain closed. Don't worry about giving me a sheet to cover up with. My modesty is gone. And it's all the way back to when I was 40 years ago, when I was 5 years old, right? And probably before that as well. But I developed this sort of like boundaryless interaction with healthcare providers because I'm like, you're going to do whatever you want anyway. I'm just not going to bother trying to pretend like I have a right to say, no, you can't touch me there, or please don't do that. So there are lots of strategies we can use, but really we need to just keep remembering the stepping stones. We're trying to tiptoe through the rapids in this. So safety is always first. How can I help you feel safer right now? And you can literally ask that question. Is there anything that would help this feel safer? Not better, not nicer, not more comfortable, safer. And using that word. And some people may not know how to answer that because we don't ask it very often. Then offer some choices and bake in the choices to everything. So an example would be, we have a 17-year-old now. And one of the things we've done in sort of our house rules is, and this of course is developmentally dependent as well, say, okay, you can have, someone over for dinner a couple nights a week. I don't care what nights it is, that's your choice. You just tell me by this time that you're going to have someone for dinner tonight. So that's, allowing choice. And hopefully that's just one tiny example. It might be, would you like the door open or closed? Would you like a light on when you go to sleep? Does it help if you have something to hold on to when you do this? Is it okay if I touch you? Would you like me to leave while you change? And those types of questions that offer choice give that person a sense of control. And hopefully that will allow them to feel like it's possible to connect with us. It might not be they can actually connect with us, but it may start to build that little path where they can connect with themselves, with others. And that's okay. That's actually really critical. So one of the most important things I've learned over the years is, rather than thinking what's wrong with this person, why do they keep doing this? I've actually learned the most powerful part of this is thinking a bit about myself. Like, what's wrong with me? I used to think that probably a dozen times a day. Swapping that out with, okay, what happened in your life that led you to react this way in this situation? And when I see others that their behavior frustrates me, angers me, mystifies me, confuses me, rather than saying, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing this? What happened that maybe has led you to a place where this is the safest way for you to interact with me right now? The other thing that we can remember is that if we're working with folks and they just seem like they won't follow rules, they won't do what we've agreed, maybe they're not following through with plans, is it possible they can't right now? And if they're in that trauma response, I use images around drowning because that young woman I was talking about who asked if I'd been to the ocean, she told me sometimes that's what she feels like. People are expecting her to learn to swim and get herself to safety, when they're saying, like, you need to do this in order to be treated with respect or in order to be given choices or control. And she can't. That when that gets triggered, she's unable to actually think through what's a better way to be right now. She just is. And she felt incredible guilt about that because she couldn't understand why. She knew better. She's like, people tell me, oh my God, you know better. She's like, yeah, I do. But for whatever reason, when I get in these situations, all of a sudden it's like, I can't get out. And people around her were expecting her to, her teachers, her parents, her workers, and so on, had expected her to figure it out when she was actually in a trauma response and unable to access the center of her brain that controls logic and reasoning and problem solving. So I mentioned this earlier, if you're thinking attention seeking or unhealthy or risky behavior or problematic behavior, what if you swapped out connection seeking, safety seeking, stress behavior, coping strategy, trauma response, just a way to remind yourself, could this be something else? And is this person truly attention seeking in a negative way? Maybe they're trying to find a tether that feels safe. And then what can I do to move them closer to safety, rather than dismissing or labeling or problematizing what's happening. And if we're working, especially with youth, often there's a lot of conversation about risk or unhealthy behaviors. And that doesn't mean, again, that we say everything goes and you're allowed to do whatever you want. But how can we understand the ways people cope with the world through a lens of trauma that might move us away from saying, well, that's a bad thing to do, self-harming or using, those are bad things, they're unhealthy. Yep, they are. People know it. Saying that doesn't change that those are very appealing ways of coping, especially if people have tried them and found that they are very helpful. And it's hard to find other ways to cope unless somebody helps us often. And we can't, as much as possible, take away those behaviors or those coping strategies without bolstering the coping that they've got, right? So if substance use or cutting or eating are the coping strategies, we can't just say no more, you're done. If we go there, what we may be doing is essentially pushing someone into a really intense trauma response, and often it escalates, doesn't improve. It may also re-traumatize. So we need to say, okay, these things aren't good. Like, this isn't helping you. It's not helping us, or it's not improving your situation. What can we add? So if you think of coping strategies as rocks in a jar, rather than just dumping the jar out and leaving a person with nothing, these are things, in spite of their downside, help this person feel safe. How can we add more rocks to the jar so that they have more to choose from? And maybe eventually they aren't going to go to those unhealthy or risky or problematic coping strategies. They're going to have more, and they're going to realize that this is a better one actually for this situation than only feeling like I have one or two to pick from and neither of them are great. So that's a really critical piece. Towards the end of the slide deck, there's some ideas that you can think about if you're in a foster adoptive home. Walk through the home with a child or youth, even if they've been there for years, and ask them to suggest changes that might help them feel safer. And at first they may focus on physical safety because that's how we talk about safety most of the time. But you can say, well, do you feel safe in your room when you're alone in there? And even young kids can say, no, I'm scared. Okay, what about this, what could make it safer? And then if they're like, if I had a unicorn in the corner, and you're like, yeah, I get that. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any unicorns lately, and it's gonna be really tough to put that in your room. So what would be close to having a unicorn in the corner? And have that transparency, and then that follow through, that consistency. Work to build, broaden, and deepen coping capacity for parents and for kids. For us, our experience of adoption resulted in some trauma, some new trauma for all of us. We didn't know that's what was happening at the time. We've had to do some work, and we're continuing to try to address it. But we spend a lot of time talking about how do we cope when things get hard. And sometimes I have a test today at school, and that's really stressing me out. Other times it's, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to stay here and you're going to kick me out of the house, even though we say over and over again, no, that's not going to happen. So how do you cope in those different situations? Doing something new, meeting someone new, right? Those are all stressful. Even exciting things can be very stressful. So how do we develop coping capacity? How do we offer choices? And so I've included some examples. And many of us already do these things. I'm not claiming to have, the corner on all the wildest ideas. Many of you are like, yeah, already do it. Create a safety plan with your child that if they get triggered, what can they do and what can you do? What are things that help? What makes it worse? How can you feel calmer and safer right now? And going there, these are also questions we need to be thinking, because if we get swept up, and often we call it activated or emotionally dysregulated, so we're getting emotional in reaction to someone who's in a trauma state, we may actually either end up in our own trauma stuff or make it worse for that person, because we don't feel safe because we're not calm and settled. So what can help me stay calm and safe right now? And be really upfront about, you can always expect this from me, and here's what I expect from you, and what do you expect from me? What do you need from me? And lots of us also have done things like family meetings and making sure the rules are posted where people can refer to them, and all of those fun things that we have to do at home. So there are hopeful things, and I'll mention this some really quickly. New research is affirming that kids who've experienced lots of adversity, trauma certainly being one of the results of that, can also have experiences that protect them or reduce the impact of that adversity across their lifespan. One of them is liking school. That doesn't necessarily mean they're good at school or they go to school all the time. Do they like it when they're there? If they do, how do we keep it that way? Which can be really challenging with kids who aren't performing well academically or aren't regularly attending, because the school policy may be, well, if this happens, this is what the consequence is, which quickly can mean school isn't something kids like anymore. So just remembering, this may be protecting this child from a long-term adverse effect of trauma. Teachers or adults who care, opportunities to have fun, just joy, can be so protective. Predictable routines, not over-structured, not over-busy, but predictable. I know that mom goes to work on Monday mornings, and I expect that she won't be home when I get home from school that day. Those types of things. So thinking about changes in our routine, even temporary ones, holidays, working from home during a pandemic, and how have we talked to kids about that? Or are we thinking how that may create a sense that things don't feel safe or as safe? And then feeling comfortable with yourself. So that includes things like not focusing on kids' bodies. And there's lots of research that says it's actually, if we're worried about kids' bodies, too big, too small, unless there's a medical reason for it, we may be actually leading them towards the world of disordered eating or other types of body image issues. So creating a world where kids can be comfortable with themselves just as they are today. And that includes, how do we not expose them to our own critiques of our bodies, because that can counteract a kid who feels they're okay and then he is living with someone where they get to witness critique of body parts or commentary about others' bodies, may erode their trust that indeed they are okay. They may start thinking, what do you think of me? Do you talk about me when I'm not in the room? Whoa, I have too much going on. And so really emphasizing things like moving that in ways that feel good, eating things that help us feel good, not focused on changing how we look or how our body is, because that can be really challenging for folks with trauma. And having a caregiver with whom you feel safe, even if it's really, really brief. So that's really important. There's a little bit about trauma healing and recovery, but I do want to shut up and let folks ask questions or comment. So I will just leave this slide up for a moment and go to Mackenzie and see if there's any questions or comments.
Yeah, perfect. There's a few. I knew you were close to the end, so I thought I might as well hang on until you got through all your stuff. Okay. So the first one that I have here is, are there any resources that you recommend for learning about how to heal from trauma and or how to help our children with trauma?
Well, here they are. I've included some resources at the end of the slide deck. The links should work on a PDF, but you may have to type in the shortened links or Google just the highlighted text, and that'll take you to them. So there's some training about trauma-informed practice, far more intensive than this little talk, which is just a real introduction. But there's a couple other pieces. There's a great resource on creating a trauma-informed environment in your foster home. Of course, that would be fine in an adoptive home as well. And then there's a trauma-informed practice guide for working with children, youth, and families. Other thing is, I have found some additional that I can send along, and we can figure out ways to share those, maybe through social media with the Adoption Support Center. There's a podcast that's on trauma-informed adoptive homes that's really great. I just found it this week. And so yeah, I'll try to keep sharing as things go along. The other thing is, you're welcome to follow me on Instagram. I'm only on Instagram in my consulting sort of business role, but I post quite regularly about trauma and resources, or you can email me if you'd like a specific support for you or your family in your area. I can often help navigate some of those questions, refer you to folks I know, or give you some pointers on how to find the resources you need. The other thing is, with specific trauma healing, if you go to this slide, we often look at talk therapy, like counseling, as the thing. It doesn't work for everyone. It isn't accessible to everyone, and it doesn't feel safe for everyone. So don't underestimate how healing it can be to find safe ways to move your body, which can be like living room dance party after school or on a Sunday afternoon. There's a thing called body-based therapy, like somatic experiencing, which isn't about talking about what happened. It's how do you hold that in your body? Even things like drumming, rhythmic, really can be powerful for folks. Mindfulness-based practices for some people work. But remember that every connection matters, and that every connection can be healing, move us closer to a sense of safety in the world and in ourselves, or it can move us further away. And we often don't know if our relationship is going to do one or the other, but we can be intentional about trying to have safe, consistent interpersonal interactions, even fleeting ones. And for lots of folks, spiritual and cultural approaches are really powerful. Ceremony, prayer, meditation, connecting with a sense of community where people feel they belong. And that might be, for young folks who identify as LGBTQ, being able to connect with folks in that community. It might be connecting with other kids who are adopted or in foster care. It might be connecting with the spiritual community or cultural community, but creating space for people to sort of explore beliefs and meaning making is about saying, okay, this stuff happened. How can I make sense of that in some way? So for some people, that means they end up in the helping professions because that's a way of meaning making. Help other people, they might tell their story, they might create art that is really informed by their experience. All of these are part of our healing, which isn't a one and done, it's a lifelong process. So hopefully that helps in a nutshell answer that question. What else is in there, Mackenzie?
There's a couple of questions or comments about how to find a trauma-informed therapy or a counselor in our province.
Okay, so there's one thing that's really important is that trauma-informed ideally should be everyone everywhere, teachers and healthcare providers, including counselors, foster parents, workers, like everybody should be trauma informed, which would mean they understand how trauma works in people and try to adjust their response or their understanding of the world to accommodate that. Trauma specific therapists, there aren't enough of them, which is why I often recommend a broader range of approaches to try to help folks address trauma. If you're looking for trauma specific, it can be challenging. One of the main resources people have access to is mental health services, which in most settings in Saskatchewan aren't set up to do ongoing trauma work. They're doing brief sort of solution focused work, which is just based on supply and demand, right? Big demand, not a lot of resources available. So if you have private counseling benefits, or a employee family assistance program that you have access to that you're covered under, those can be resources to ask for referrals. Make sure you say trauma specific, but also Indigenous folks through non-insured health benefits. There's an approved mental health provider list that I can help hook you up with if you're looking at that, where people can get quite a significant number of sessions, and there's quite a large number of folks available throughout the province. So that might be another option.
Okay. Another question that we have here is, how do you rebuild or improve a relationship with someone who made a decision that led to your trauma? So what are strategies to heal, forgive, and improve a relationship like that?
Well, the first thing I'll say about that is it's not an obligation to have to do it. And then sometimes the circumstances are such that it's what we want and what we feel would be best, or it's what we have to do to carry on. But I always reminded folks, and I've reminded myself repeatedly, that it's not a necessity. We can heal without rebuilding or forgiving. It's possible. And it's very individual what works for folks. If they do decide to go down the road of trying to rebuild, most often though, one of the core pieces of that, when it is relatively successful, is being able to share your story, your truth, whatever version of it feels safe with that person, and have them at least acknowledge some understanding for the harm that was caused. And it can be really tough if you go to the extent of being vulnerable enough to do that and you don't get that back. You don't get that, oh, wow, I didn't know, or I'm sorry, and often, and it may be trauma related, people can't hear it. They aren't ready to, they aren't willing to, and that can actually re-traumatize us. So it's something that I tend to proceed with caution on quite often. But if people feel a real pull to that, it's often a really, it best done as a lots of time for self-reflection, self-compassion, and especially this would be a time that would make sense if you had a counselor who was sort of coaching and debriefing and helping guide through that process can be really helpful.
Perfect. I think we just have a couple more questions. So can you tell us about a time when you had to remain calm when dealing with a hostile client? What did you learn from the experience and how did you handle the situation?
Yeah, I learned a lot about my own emotional regulation or lack of emotional regulation. I used to work in a drop-in center for folks who were street involved often, and we had a sort of, you can come in no matter what you're on, no matter what you're using, as long as you are respectful of the space and the people in the space, which most days was brilliant, went great. We had once in a while, folks would get usually triggered. It usually wasn't the drugs that actually resulted in that, aggression or violence. It was people who'd been triggered. And what how we used to handle it is we were all trained in some nonviolent communication and, sort of alternatives to physical intervention. I mean, I'm 5'2" and have a million joint problems. So I'm not exactly going to physically restrain someone or try to physically intervene. But a lot of it is keeping yourself as calm as possible. And I learned that when I see anger, I tend to freeze, and that isn't helpful. The situation I have in mind was really quite terrifying for me. And I realized I just shut down and I couldn't even talk. And it was a prompt for me to explore that because I'd never experienced with that intensity anyway. And when I finally sort of found my voice again, I felt really shaky and really like, I'm such a pushover right now. This person's gonna walk all over me. Thankfully, I was able to have colleagues who could step in and have my back that I trusted. And that's when I learned the importance of feeling safe in my work and safe with my partner, even in terms of things that might happen in our house. And the how essential that is, that if there's someone you feel you can trust and you feel safe with, but also acknowledging if that isn't the case, you may have to work extra hard at that emotional regulation. And there's lots of great stuff online right now. If you just Google emotional self-regulation, we're teaching kids it in elementary school, which is great. Most of us adults never learned how to do it. And I am still trying to figure that out, actually. So, but yeah, get some exercises, do some practice with your kids, whatever, on how do I tell when I'm starting to become emotionally activated or shut down, And then what can I do to sort of head that off at the pass and keep me in that calm, responsive state where I'm not getting pulled into someone else's stuff.
Awesome. The last question that we have here is, where can I get more training in becoming trauma informed?
Ooh, there are some in the links at the end. There's some modules. There's also, depending on where people are coming from, if this is for work or for home or both. There's a variety of resources available through some of the links that I've provided. You can also email me, and I do full day training on being trauma informed. That's more, well, pre-pandemic, it was interactive and in person, but where we do more around the practice, not just the sort of theory. So you can also email me and I can point you in that direction, or let you know where else I have lined up, or talk about organizing a training for your community even.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. It's 8:40 now, so I guess we'll cut off the questions.